Hi, this is Mark. In this video, I'm going to explain key differences between BPD and bipolar. Of course, with any disorder, there's going to be a bound that psychiatrists define. And so if you go to any different psychiatrist or any such psychiatrist, they're going to have a different limit, and you may not fit within their categorization of the disorder for based on their understanding. And of course, everyone has a different understanding, and it's not going to be a perfect solution. Or because a lot of these disorders are, some of them could be very loosely defined, and we're not so, it's not so definitive. There's always going to be what ifs, or there's always going to be other questions that are unanswered. But in terms of bipolar, we know a few key characteristics, such as a biological cycle. And generally, with any cycle that is biological, for instance, think of I like to bring up the blood sugar cycle, just because it consists of, just like any cycle, there's a pattern, but within this, and there's like it depends on the eating habits, of course, and many different variables. But generally, what there is there's some level your body's trying to achieve balance or some equilibrium. So anytime your blood sugar spikes, there's a force that pulls it back down. And of course, with the insulin, the sensitivity of the receptors to insulin can induce that effect. And so, of course, your body has this like biochemical reactions that help balance any such reaction within the body. So what goes up must come down. Just like with the yin yang, you have the negative, you also have a positive. You have the light, you have darkness, you have different areas. So same with bipolar is focused on a biological cycle. Of course, it's a mood cycle, which can be very complex because the mood cycle is very it depends on other cycles, like it depends on the diurnal cycle, the sleep cycle, the hormone cycle can influence and act as catalyst to the mood cycle. So all these individual cycles kind of work together. But one thing to note is that given that the body tries to promote equilibrium, naturally in a healthy state, these cycles tend to be very smooth. Like think of blood sugar again, for instance. When you start going into tending to pre-diabetes, or you're tending towards diabetes, you end up noticing, you naturally have a smooth cycle, but then it starts becoming more rigid, or becomes more kind of chaotic, more sporadic. It's not, your body actually tries to overcompensate for the lack of sensitivity of the receptors. So there tends to be a flux of insulin into the body that is much more than is needed for a certain period. And so, you start going through this pre-diabetic stage, which is like more of like a break from the equilibrium. You're going up with more magnitude. You're having larger dips. So eventually, it reaches the point when you hit diabetes, and that's like where you break the force that pulled it down. The insulin or the sensitivity to receptors is now broken, or it's totally starts becoming insensitive, and therefore you can't go. You maintain a static high, or this may even keep going up, and it may keep going up, so forth, and it's not contained. Same with the mood cycle. It's naturally it should be smooth, so we kind of understand the day-to-day basis. Now, the thing is with the cycles is if you take all the other variables, you just take the mood and other individual cycles that comprise of the whole, and you take all external factors outside of the equation. For instance, like naturally, what you're going to find is you naturally have this smooth cycle. Even with bipolar, there's still going to be a lot of times there's consistency, there's a pattern of oscillation, and it depends on many factors. Sometimes seasonal effects or stress can induce it. There's other variables, but generally the difference in bipolar is it stems from these biological changes. It stems from, it's not kind of created more, not necessarily, it's not connected or tied to the mindset necessarily. It's not, it's just the ebbs and flows or the biological change that is occurring. and it has this kind of like this clock or a biological clock, just like the sleep cycle has a clock. And and a lot of times there tends to be a pattern because like our lifestyle, if our lifestyle has this like if you exhibit, starting to exhibit bipolar disorder, and you have a certain lifestyle, you may notice that because of the lifestyle, depending on how contained it is, it kind of creates the biological is very sensitive to changes in uh, lifestyle patterns as well. So of course, like depending on how you position yourself in life, it can alter your biological because there's a strong connection like with the sleep cycle and bipolar. Anytime you break away from the natural rhythm, it kind of disrupts this, then all the other cycles, like the biological cycles, and that can disrupt and potentiate bipolar disorder, or even act as a catalyst to mania. But now, when it comes to BPD or borderline personality disorder, this is more to do with it's more of a mindset shift. So you can definitely, the biggest catalyst is a shift. The mood changes due to disruption. It's more as a strong tie to validation, and I think anyone wants. We all have degrees of wanting. We want to receive validation, but the thing is, with borderline, because there's been like maybe childhood trauma, or there's been some disruption in childhood that has kind of disrupted the formulation of the identity itself. It's thin, the shell that protects you, that has this, gives you the security. And when that's very thin, you need validation to compensate. Just like ADHD, think of ADHD. ADHD is when you lack its receptivity of your dopamine, and you don't get that reward feedback that is natural. That seems it's more dampened for like menial tasks. When you have someone with ADHD who's doing monotonous or repetitive tasks, they don't get the same feedback naturally like other people would receive, and therefore to compensate they must focus on hyperinterest to get that reward feedback to get back to level. Otherwise it would really cause a lot of depression or irritability in ADHD or someone with ADHD. It's because they have that thin, they're very, very unstable within that region. So if they're in that lifestyle, it can become very unstable for them because they're not getting the feedback, and it's very a thin shell. So with borderline, the same way. It's just because of that thin, to overcompensate for the lack of feedback in childhood. To overcompensate, you need to kind of go above and beyond, or you kind of just you crave it at such high intensity. But the problem is if it's not received, because of that the proportion that you crave the validation, what ends up happening is it creates this polar force. It's not really a force, but think of like in a polar aspect. If you go like with bipolar, you go up. If you go higher in the realms of mania, you're going to have a lower crash. So what goes up must come crashing down, and to conserve energy. It's all about conservation of energy. Now with BPD, because of this intensity, seeking the validation, or trying to get because you lack the security and you have to try to maintain that. Well, if you don't get that feedback, it causes a negative reaction, and this is why it's a vicious feedback loop. And this is why, because of that, it's so intense that BPD can have more frequent swings in mood, because the world's chaotic. We know we can't predict what on a localized scale. You can't really predict things because it's all like more chaotic. Now globally you can generalize, but on localized it's like you don't know, like not everyone's going to validate, not everyone's going to do this. They have their own life, they're doing this, they're doing that, and so forth. And that can cause some disruptions, and then it can cause this, because what happens with BPD is happens to be caused by, it triggers a very sensitive nervous system. Because whatever trauma that was there initially, it still sticks with you, and it hits harder. So the emotions tend to be very intense, and of course with others with BPD can become very aware of this, of course. And there's always it's just like a battle. So with BPD, it's more so, it's just a battle of your own, you know, the childhood, the issues that stem from the childhood, and basically that reaction that's still like ingrained within there, and it's very hard to repress it. And when it does, it kind of builds up and may even lead to potentiating the problem. And I think the key is so that's the main key difference. And I think there's also a BPD. There's some cognitive dissonance. I guess to do that, it's just a coping mechanism to a degree. Um, like when you have this negative reaction, you almost try to find ways to repress it as much as you can, because you don't want to have such an intense reaction or negative, and it causes all that spikes. So there's different pathways to deal with it, and sometimes with BPD they may become, I guess there's something called like quiet borderline, or there are even more avoidant tendencies. It's a very broad spectrum, so there's a lot of coexistence or overlap with avoidant personality, BPD, and even narcissistic tendencies. And of course, it seems like that because, again, I mentioned the validation seeking behavior, which is not, there's nothing wrong. I mean, it's basically, it just stemmed from the initial, the trauma that kind of created this void, trying to fill that void with such intensity, and it doesn't always, the viewpoint may be distorted. A lot of times with BPD, they talk about like black and white thinking, because it's just anytime you have a high range of emotion, of course, it can create with all these reactions, it really contorts, or kind of distorts the viewpoints. Like I've dealt with depression at times, and I've understood that depression is almost like a closure of the consciousness. It's like when consciousness is collapsing and it's going towards a point, whereas you become less open, you become more closed, you become almost, it's almost like you're how would I put it? Not fake, but you try to do the best you can to give a different image, or view, or impression of what's actually occurring. So a lot of times, from the surface, it may not seem so, such a case that someone is depressed, but in actuality, it's the case, just because and sometimes it can be hard to tell, because you kind of you don't with depression, it's like once you experience that range, it kind of the spectrum, because you can go from deep depression all the way to the round, you can go into the throes of mania. And when you experience a broad range, even with BPD, with the intensity, the up and down, that kind of happens more. It's more due to external sources. BPD is, of course, attached to that external reaction, and whatever triggered that reaction. So anytime you have these like oscillations, it can kind of, it definitely makes, opens, or it can lend to positive reinforcement. I like to think of every time you fall, you can come back stronger. You have the repository of what happened, like everything that you condensed, or you're able to funnel and learn from that, and experience. And I guess you can try to build a resistance and find ways to become more aware of what ended up, what was the causation of all this, to occur. And then you build up a repository over time by experiencing this spectrum that not otherwise wouldn't have been attained. So I think it's always good, even though negative experiences can be reverted and turned into a positive outcome. So of course, and that's just changing the mindset. It's always growth. There's always a solution. To me, I just think the solution's out there. You just got to seek it. It's not always going to be immediate. Nothing's instantaneous. And except like, of course, we can get all these instantaneous rewards, and maybe because of that we seek it, and we want it more frequency. But the problem is, the key is kind of, I guess, to try to take things globally, and then try to change the mindset. Try to change, kind of be open to what has, all the information that has, funneled through. And of course, that can be very difficult in depression or, spells, because it closes off, you know, your reality or your consciousness, or what you can actually. Uh, a lot of times, it's like when light turns to darkness, or everything becomes foggy, and your perception becomes blurred, and you become apathetic, and you become, just your mind becomes blank. You lose the creativity. All that, gets attributed with depression. But of course, it's just, again, a cycle, and there's ways to try to mitigate it and maintain health. Try to build health. Again, and I think with with bipolar, it's more to do with like health, the state of equilibrium. The body biologically is losing the ability to minimize the range of these cycles. So of course, someone bipolar who uses alcohol as a coping mechanism, or just to ease the anxiety, is actually potentiating the possible range of these cycles, and getting further and further from, like, uh, how would I put it? It's basically eventually going to break the communication between the neurotransmitters, and then lead to a constant dysphoria. Like, just like in pre-diabetics, you go up and down, up and down, up and down, just like mania, but then again, and then eventually you drink so much, your brain gets so toxic, and then eventually you're in constant dysphoria, just like diabetes. That's just like that, where you lose the communication between the synapses. You break because of the toxicity. Even BPD can kind of cause this, because if it's related to the nervous system sensitivity, it can trigger biological problems, and that's why they say there could be some coexistence between BPD and bipolar, which could be possible, just because the nervous system, you're causing shifts in energy every time you have your mindset shift, and you go into this, negative mindset due to an external response. What ends up happening is you're causing all these shifts in energy, and you could kind of build a conjecture that maybe this could create a disequilibrium and potentiate the possible risk of bipolar disorder. So therefore, could possibly be coexistence. You know, um, so that could be definitely true, and I think there's a lot of complication and overlap between these disorders. Sometimes it's just the thing with bipolar is you try to isolate the variables and try to consider if you can find a pattern between your state of mood and, without take away all the external factors, and see, notice if you do actually, have this oscillation that seems it's more smooth, but it has a usually longer duration between the periods, and because bipolar has to do with conservation of energy. And you go through mania, it takes a lot of energy, and then depending on the severity, you're going to crash. And then you're going to go through this, depending on how much energy was expended, you're going to go through, it's going to be proportional to the duration of the depression. So, of course, with bipolar, the length tends to be much longer. Of course, they say there's ultra cyclical depression or bipolar, which, I mean, it could be, possible if there's like a really break between something severely wrong with the synapse or the connections, that it's creating like almost like a to shut off, to turn on and off. There's something wrong with that maybe the cycles could be very, very, very high, or much higher in frequency. So then again, when you get into that, it gets kind of hard to determine, especially even with mixed state. Anyone who has mania has also most likely experienced a mixed state, which can actually, generally, think of all the like different state of moods. You could be mixed together. Like, you have anxiety, you have irritability, you have some depression symptoms, some manic symptoms. Your brain is racing, but you're also kind of like tired, or you're very motivated, and then you like randomly cry at one moment, or you get mad, or you get irritated, and then you're kind of like going all over the place. Or it could be, just maybe not as chaotic, but you kind of have a blended mix of mania and and depressive symptoms. So maybe you sleep a lot, and then but you're also like goal-oriented and kind of distracted and hypersexual and so forth. So yeah, there's a lot of these differences, and of course mixed episodes can kind of co overlap with the BPD, because it with BPD, your moods can kind of oscillate a lot too within a short range, depending on the external factors. So a lot of times with BPD, I think BPD, they're very sensitive to external emotions. I think this pattern seems to ring true in a lot of cases, because it makes sense, because if that is attached to the nervous system, and basically you're constantly sensitive to those external factors. It could be people's reactions or whatnot. Then of course it's going to cause your mood to follow almost the societal moods, right? So, so in any given situation, it just seems like someone bipolar would kind of take on the mood of whatever is within the environments. So of course, that's probably why like someone BPD could be have avoidant tendencies. And of course, this reaction is probably due to early on that they had to kind of acclimate or adapt that kind of mode or that kind of shift to prepare as a defense mechanism to prepare for those cases as a survival. So it's predicated on survival. So, but to minimize that, it's I guess key to build some awareness and try to work on finding ways to manage these the nervous system reactions, and kind of I think the best thing is to put yourself in like-minded areas, like-minded positive environments, not where there's a lot of chaos. Of course, bipolar is already predicated on chaotic swings and moods. So if you put yourself in a chaotic region with a lot of variability in personalities, for instance, you're likely going to have a lot of variability in mood. But if you go in an area with like-minded interest, you're going to find that it's probably going to be more tolerable. So therefore, it's going to try to minimize, all these reactions. And then, of course, with bipolar, it's key to like minimize stress, because of course triggers for all these cyclic shifts, as with anything, it's anything that triggers this biochemical internal change. And that could be stress, it could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be just even traumatic experiences as well. But just because having a sensitive internal system, in this way, it could be to the external, world. There is some relation there as well. But with bipolar, it's like generally there's clear. Anytime when someone bipolar goes through depression, it's more so stems from being extremely tired, lethargic. Depression is not really irritability. To me, I find the transition period into depression to be the overlap to be irritability. Depression itself is like you're just tired, you're dull, your emotions are gone, you're complete like in a fog, you can't think well, everything's slowed down. Think of mania as everything speeds up, so you're doing the opposite of that. And think of mania as like this heightened creativity. Well, bipolar is like you're losing you're losing that passion, you're losing expression, right? So I think irritability is more inclined to be in terms of it could be a mixed manic episode or even BPD. BPD, you notice a pattern is there's a lot more irritability in terms of the emotional regulation. And when there's like depression, there's a lot more of that irritability kind of in the background. Versus like bipolar, they're not going to be so reactive, because it has to do with like their internal system is just so torn up that of course it can create explosions as well, but it's more so the validation seeking is not as extreme. So in that case, it's not going to cause too many problems in that area. But of course, if there's overlap or if there's coexistence, comorbidity, then of course you got to deal with both problems. But yeah, that's just kind of my take at it. I think these disorders can be very hard sometimes to define, and then this is my viewpoint, and hope it helped, and I will see you next time.